Hi, everybody. Welcome to your history class and welcome to Nyack College. I hope you're having a nice day on this freezing cold day. Today, we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution, what does that mean? Well, it was the start, the dawning of the industrial age, meaning that people were going to begin to use machinery instead of doing things by hand. And since the beginning of civilization, people lived in small villages. But to the mid-1700s, that was about when things began to change because things were being invented, all right? And the period of change lasted from 1750 to the 1850s, and that's known as the Industrial Revolution. Now, we've talked a lot about revolutions. This isn't the fighting kind. This is more like the scientific revolution that we spoke about a few weeks back. The discovery of new inventions and new ideas. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution began in the 18th century when agriculture was starting to change and things were becoming more industrialized. More machinery was being used. The first transcontinental railroad was being built at this time. Transcontinental, crossing from both sides, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And if you remember when I did Dr. Zinn's class, we talked about racial prejudice during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad against the Chinese. Well, this railroad was quite an invention because people could travel from one side of the country to the other much more easily and quicker. It was also another time when electricity is being invented. And electricity, of course, made things easier, right? Electricity let people run machinery. And then one of the other things that is credited towards the Industrial Revolution is the cotton gin. The cotton gin was a machine which was made to remove the seeds from cotton so that it could be woven into thread and in fiber. Prior to the cotton gin, people had to pick out seeds. There are 4 stages of the Industrial Revolution, okay? The first begins in 1765, and it's where the biggest changes start. Agriculture is beginning to be replaced by industry, okay? People are moving from farms and rural areas into the cities. Plus, with the extraction of coal and the invention of the steam engine, people were able to travel more on steamships and carry more goods from one place to another, transport goods from one place to another. So what does that mean for a country? It means that the economy is going to get better because they can produce more goods and transport them from one place to the other more easily. There's the second Industrial Revolution, and that started at the end of the 19th century. Okay, remember, 19th century is the 1800s. Advancements were made, okay? So electricity and gas and oil were being used. Gas lighting was big, then electricity's coming in. Oil's being used, and that helps with transportation. Inventions that come up are the internal combustion engine. Things that helped with communication, the telegraph, and later the telephone. So now, not only can people travel from one place to the other quickly and more easily, not only can they produce materials and goods quickly and more easily, they can transport those goods more quickly and easily. And then again, of course, communication now is picking up with the advent of the telegraph and the telephone. So things are moving along, okay? And the automobile comes into play. You know, of course, everyone doesn't have an automobile, but some do. The rich usually do, and so they can get around with that as well. So the second industrial revolution is considered the most important. Then we have the third portion of the Industrial Revolution, and that's starting around 1966, when telecommunications becomes big. Electronics are invented, computers are starting up, okay? We have cell phones start after that. So with the idea of computers, of course, everything changes. We don't have to look up things in the same way that we used to. We can communicate with each other over a computer. We can get information back and forth very quickly. So that's the third part of the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to show you a little bit of a video, and this is about the Industrial Revolution. So let's see if we can get that. All right.
The Industrial Revolution was probably one of the greatest transformations in human history. Arguably, it has changed how humans live more than any event since the Agricultural Revolution. Industrialization, producing goods on a scale beyond what could be made in the home, has helped to shape the kind of work we do today. It led to fewer farmers, fewer artisans, and more people in well-paid jobs in factories, or in jobs that support factories. It changed where we live, moving us from rural villages or small towns into apartments and houses in big cities. It even influenced how our days are structured. The school bell and the factory whistle and shift work reshaped our understanding of time. It gave us a world of mass-produced stuff, from clothing to tools to iPhones, all obtainable only with money we earn from our industrial jobs. And increasingly, it affects the very air we breathe and the water we drink. And since the Industrial Revolution began in the 18th century, these changes have happened more rapidly and spread to more places around the world. How did the Industrial Revolution begin? To answer that question, we are going to focus on the region where it all started, Northern England. It was here that the coal-fired steam engine, the textile factory, and the other elements of modern industrialization first all came together in the mid-18th century. But why was this part of England specifically at the heart of these incredible and turbulent transformations? I'm here at the Cap House Colliery at the National Coal Mining Museum to begin the search for answers to that question. This is a colliery, a mine from which coal is extracted. Coal fueled the Industrial Revolution. It was coal that made new steam engines possible, and it was these new steam engines that powered industrial factories, trains, and steamships. The first steam engines were rudimentary and were not invented in Britain. They were first invented in China, some 100 years before the Industrial Revolution. So why did steam-powered industrialization take off in Britain and not China? Some historians argue Britain had a unique set of environmental factors that made coal-fired steam power cheap and easy here. First, Britain had very large coal deposits. The coal was also quite near the surface. That means they were easy to mine with 18th century technology. The only problem was that these mines sometimes filled up with water, but steam engines solved that problem. The first steam engines in England, which were very inefficient, were in fact used to pump water out of coal mines. They were so inefficient that they were only useful in a place where coal was pretty much free, at the head of the mines. In addition, British coal mines were close to cities, where factories and cheap labour to work in them were in ready supply. Finally, Britain is quite flat, which made it possible to build canals to connect the cities to the coal. I'm here with Alan and Taz, 459 feet and 2.5 inches underground, to find out about the importance of coal and what life was like for miners. So why was coal important for the Industrial Revolution in Britain?
Well, they discovered it could make steam. There's no steam without coal. Coal were important, and obviously steam, it were used to generate pumps, steam engines to wind men in and out at mine. The first cars were steam, yeah? So it's been a massive part of this country's history and helped to make it what it is today. Without coal and steam, well, this country won't be as great as what it is today.
So how was the coal taken out of the mine and where did it go?
Well, in early days, it was taken out of mine by manual labour. Women, children, anybody that needed employment were employed in the mines.
In the early days, when they started getting into what you might think it's a deep mine, 140 metres, there was a bucket, big bucket called the kibble, yeah? That would be lowered down, loaded up, and then they'd have a horse on a rope going around a wheel gin, which lifted the coal. Slow process, but they still managed to get it out.
And obviously they started shallow and then they went deeper and deeper as technology progressed. The turning point was steam power, really, because the coal burnt in steam boilers to produce steam power, which then motivated the production of coal, because we could pump water out at ground and we could go deeper and deeper into thicker and more productive seams.
The availability of coal wasn't the only reason that Britain was uniquely suited to industrialisation. For better or for worse, Britain was a nation with a long history of trade. In particular, Britain had been in the textile industry for centuries, raising sheep, turning their wool into cloth, and selling that cloth to Europe and the wider world. In 1700, about 70% of British exports were woolen products. So, it was a short but significant step from the kinds of small-scale textile production in the pre-industrial era to the large textile mills of the industrial era. I've come to Nottingham in the Midlands of England to find out more about the role of textiles in the development of the Industrial Revolution. I'm here at the Lace Hall with Richard Braun. So Richard, what kinds of textiles were produced here in Nottingham?
Lace, mainly lace. After 200 lace factories, only one actually running still in Nottingham.
So how was lace produced before the Industrial Revolution?
Most likely by hand. Then they produced the machine, which you had to power it yourself, with moving pedals and things like this. And then they produced the first lace machine, which was powered by a shaft driven by a steam engine. And then after that, it went from steam engine to an electric motor.
Beyond commodities, Britain had finance. Partly because of the long history of textile production, Britain had lots of merchants and other people who financed and made money from trade. These people became increasingly powerful in British government over many centuries. As a result, by the 18th century, British laws were very friendly to those in industry and trade. The country had a number of banks that supported new industrial ventures, and there were lots of laws to protect private property. The availability of finance and legal protections encouraged people in England to take risks and invest in new enterprises like factories. Some of the most important of the new laws were patent laws, which protected people's rights to profit from their new inventions, such as the machines that run the collieries and mills.
Remember we talked about
Another reason that factory owners in England adopted machines so rapidly was because wages were so high here compared to many other parts of the world. As a result, it was too expensive to hire lots of people. So business owners looked for ways to save money by having machines do the work instead. You might consider the rise of AI and robots that do the work of humans today. Pretty similar thinking. Some historians think that Britain's industrialisation wasn't principally a result of these internal factors at all, but rather really a result of its place in global networks of trade and at the head of a vast empire. The list of global contributions to industrialisation proposed by historians is a long one. Some historians argue that profits made from the trade in enslaved Africans and their labour on Caribbean plantations helped fund technological innovations like the steam engine. Others point out that food grown or fished in the American colonies by settlers, often taught by indigenous people, flooded into Britain, allowing people there to concentrate on factory work rather than farming. Similarly, natural resources flowed into Britain from their colonies. Timber and cotton were particularly important, but also the colonies were a captive market for British industrial products once British factories began to produce them. All of these factors, money, food, resources, and markets, may well have spurred industrialisation in Britain first. The Industrial Revolution helped to make Britain a global power and create the largest territorial empire in history. Slavery, the exploitation of workers at home and abroad, and questionable trade arrangements were fueled by technology, personal ingenuity, geography, and the laws of the land. The term Industrial Revolution can hide these unique elements coming together that not only changed the lives of everyone involved, but also the lives of everyone who came after.
Okay, so let's look at this. What are they telling us? Textiles. What is textiles? Textile means fabric. So instead of being a cottage industry, a home industry, where women were weaving by hand on a loom, now a machine could do that and produce cloth more quickly. So that way they could make clothing cheaply. People had more of things. You could make blankets and whatever. So the textiles were something that was really promoted. We saw where they were talking about lace. Well, women used to sew that lace and make it by hand. Well, now you could make lace on a machine. So if it's easily made and made more quickly, the price goes down. Remember that this was also going on in Europe and in the United States. And these machines and this production were making a big difference in how people thought and where they lived. For instance, back when they were farming, they did everything at home. The family all worked together in one location to make sure that they had everything they needed. The men would usually go out hunting and fishing to get food. All right, the women would stay home cooking and sowing seeds outside and making clothing and taking care of the house. As the Industrial Revolution starts, okay, we start to see a shift from the farms to the city because there are a lot of jobs there, all right? And this Industrial Revolution has changed the way we live today. Let me go over a few things that may not seem like they were that important, but were basic inventions during the in fact, I'll start with the early Industrial Revolution. The flying shuttle. It was a way to, and we'll see something about that, but it was a way to weave more quickly. It's flying by, it's going quickly. So weaving took place quicker. The spinning jenny was a way to spin wool into yarn, not with a spinning wheel, but much quicker, okay? Again, I mentioned the cotton gin a few minutes ago. This was a machine that separated cotton from its seeds. Very important to sit there and pick them all out, or it goes through a machine and the seeds are all gone, all right? Then, of course, we have the telegraph. The telegraph made it easy to send news and information across the country quickly. Another thing that was developed during the Industrial Revolution was concrete, cement. That meant that buildings could be bigger and stronger because the foundations could be made with the concrete. The steam engine, again, the steam engine was what took the locomotives, the trains, and powered them, and also ships. Steam ships would move things around from one place to another. And some of those things were people. People would go on a steamship to go different places. All right. They also then had phonographs. They created the modern battery. So the modern battery is very important. We don't think anything of putting a battery in our flashlight, but there weren't any before the Industrial Revolution. So I'd like to go over a few things. There's going to be more inventions, but let's look at this next video where we can see some of the inventions for the Industrial Revolution. Okay, hold on.
What's the difference between a child that gets into a top tier school versus a lower tier school? Trust me, it's not what you think. Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Hong, and for the last 10 plus years, we've worked with over 800 families to help get their students into the university they deserve so that their child can have the best future possible. In fact, in the last admission cycle, over 50% of our students got accepted into a top 25 university with an average acceptance rate of 9.3%. Universities like Stanford, Harvard, Columbia, MIT, UC Berkeley, University.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So we're going to turn our attention today to the Industrial Revolution, one of the most significant developments in human history. Like, imagine with me that it's 1820. I got this idea from the economist Robert Gordon, by the way. You live in, say, England. You probably work in agriculture. When you walk to town, you're either pulling your own cart, or if you're lucky, you have a horse. You have no running water or electricity. When you wash your few items of clothing, you do so by hand. You cook over a fire. You think of time not primarily in minutes and hours, but mostly in relationship to solar cycles, how close it is to night, or to morning, or to midwinter. And in all these respects, your life in 1820 is basically identical to the lives of people in 1720 or 1520, or for that matter, 1220. Now, that's not to say that nothing has changed in those hundreds of years. As we've explored in this series, lots has changed. But as Gregory Clark observed, in terms of standard of living, Europeans in 1800 basically led lives similar to those of Neanderthals. Now imagine that you close your eyes in 1820 and wake up in 1920. By now, most people in England do not work in agriculture. They may work in shops or transportation or mining or workshops or in factories. They measure time in minutes. Cars exist. Some people have radios which transmit information through thin air. A few people even have refrigerators which dramatically decrease food spoilage and the risk of foodborne illness. Occasionally, you might even see an airplane flying in the sky. Oh, and also your country has just emerged from an astonishingly deadly war fought with highly lethal weapons like chlorine gas, weapons that people of 1820 could not possibly have imagined. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. In this series, we've already talked about revolutions in agriculture that increased European productivity and revolutions in trade that increasingly distributed goods among people in towns and cities instead of having each individual family produce everything it needed. And these forces combined to help create more division of labor, like farmers could focus on farming and textile workers could focus on textile creation, which was more efficient than having each family do every kind of work. So let's begin in the 18th century, when European industrial production is said to have begun. Europe's population was growing after centuries of nonstop wars and plagues and the worst of the Little Ice Age. Meanwhile, products such as coffee and tea and chocolate made with heated water killed bacteria, while products from abroad expanded and varied the pool of nutrients, with corn and potatoes, for instance, generally being more calorie-dense per acre than wheat. In short, lives were getting better and longer, and populations were rising, and this meant that, on average, people had a little more time to learn and tinker and experiment. Many different artisans invented small improvements to existing mechanical devices. Perhaps most famously, John Kay's flying shuttle increased the pace and productivity of weaving. Weavers then needed a greater amount of thread, so tinkerers made that happen by producing inventions such as the spinning jenny, created around 1764 by craftsman James Hargreaves. The spinning jenny was a machine used by individual women working at home, and it allowed a person, using just the power of their hand, to spin not one bobbin of thread, but up to 120 at once. In England, Ellen Hacking and her husband John were among those devising carding machines to straighten cotton and wool fibers for spinning, and at about the same time, Richard Arkwright and his partners invented the water frame, another kind of spinning machine that used water power. And when spinning machines could be linked to a central power source, such as water, many could be placed in a single building. So the world's first factories arose, in part from the pressure to increase production of English cloth for global and domestic markets. Did the center of the world just open? Is one of my polo shirts in there? This cost like $41. Twice a year I go to a polo outlet in southern Indiana and just buy as many of these things as they'll sell to me. And look, I'm not here to advertise polo shirts, but this thing is incredibly comfortable, and also it's like dyed a specific color. Everything about this was completely unimaginable in the early 19th century. In fact, you know what? It's so soft to the touch, I think I'm gonna put it on. Is that weird? Oh yeah, I feel like I'm the bad guy in an 80s movie. How do I look, Stan? Oh. Stan says I look like Steve Bannon. Okay, thus ends that experiment. Back to the show. Let's talk about porcelain. Another tinkerer was the alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger, who promised the king of Saxony that he could figure out how to make porcelain. Porcelain was such an obsession that wealthy people collected it, and even those with far less would try to buy a piece or two, like a cup or a plate, as we see in many Dutch, French, and other paintings. Two things you see a lot in European paintings of the affluent or those who aspired to affluence: porcelain and pineapples, which were also quite rare and expensive and difficult to produce domestically. Porcelain was also practical because Europeans didn't know other ways to make heat-resistant dishware for their hot drinks. So Böttger was virtually imprisoned until around 1708 when he finally figured out how to make porcelain, although not as beautifully as the Chinese or Japanese did. What we're trying to get at here is that while people love a great story of an inventor and their invention, the Industrial Revolution was the result of lots and lots of people working together, making a series of incremental improvements rather than like geniuses from on high creating amazing things. The real genius of humans is collaboration and also spying. Like, for instance, industrial spies helped with every development in the Industrial Revolution because other regions were far more advanced than Europe in manufacturing, for instance, color-fast dyes, or heat-resistant dishware, or fine weaving and spinning, or even metallurgy. Arkwright, for example, mostly copied designs from imported textiles, and it was those cotton textiles that really caught the imagination of consumers and filled pockets, first of the people who imported textiles from India and China, and then of the daring manufacturers who were successful at copying the lightweight and colorful and washable cotton clothing. But industrial production of cotton was really risky. Like, the rate of business failure during the Industrial Revolution was over 50%, and because of that, experimenting manufacturers worked to keep labor costs as low as they could. One way was to use unpaid orphans from government or religious or charitable institutions as labor. At a time when people didn't know a lot about steam-powered machinery and its dangers, industrial accidents happened all the time, and children were often the victims. Children worked incredibly long hours, and deaths were common. Little Mary Richards was caught up in a machine, and 6- and 7-year-old orphans working alongside her witnessed the, quote, bones of her arms, legs, thighs, etc. successively snap. Her head appeared dashed to pieces, her blood thrown about like water from a twirled mop. Now, I know that's very graphic, but I think it's important to understand the extent of industrial oppression, including the industrial oppression of children. Workers lost arms and eyes and fingers or were otherwise disfigured. Production and profits always came first in an attempt to avoid financial ruin. And industry had other repercussions. It initially increased the demand for slaves even more, for instance. Slaves produced food for workers who had left farms for factories. Slaves also produced tropical crops such as sugar and tobacco and coffee that boosted the energy of many types of workers. And slaves produced the palm and other tropical oils to keep machinery running, as well as the raw materials for industry, especially cotton. It's important to understand that industry thrived due to slave labor and inexpensive child labor, and also through the labor of women who were paid less than men. Over time, more and more people began working in industrialized settings or in economic sectors that supported industry, due in part to the development of the steam engine. In 1776, English inventor James Watt launched a steam engine that improved earlier models. Now, as far back as Roman Egypt and then Ottoman Egypt and China, people had known about steam engines, but Watt's engine was much more efficient, which made it useful in replacing producing animal and water power, not just in mines, but also powering textile factories and then other machinery. For millennia, almost all human power came from our muscles. Then we harnessed some animal power and eventually some wind and water power. But steam power completely revolutionized how much work could be done on behalf of humans, and also, of course, changed transportation when it was attached to covered and uncovered wagons and ships to make trains and steamships, and eventually automobiles. And the train created, in turn, another kind of demand, because as urbanization
call that your YouTube is not showing to them, like these cutoff, so make them move in there. Not like that.
Lucidchart makes intelligent diagramming easy and helps your best ideas become real. Start from scratch or get started with templates. Lucidchart integrates with your favorite software applications.
Hi, I'm John
so
Green,
it
and
works
this is
where you
Crash
work.
Course European History. So today,
Share documents with
Hold
teammates.
on, okay, let's see if we
Commenting
can
and tagging make it easy to align with your team. Understand the past so you can build your future.
hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European
Hold
History.
on, we'll get you there. Okay, I'm sorry that you couldn't see all of that, but let me go over some of the things I talked about. All of the inventions that I mentioned before we saw the video were about the fact that these things let people make items quickly and cheaply, all right? And people were beginning to get more and more things that they wanted, cheaper clothing. They could trade different things with each other. They could exchange messages and information with the telegraph. So the social changes that took place during the Industrial Revolution were an increased wealth for most people, but not all. You saw partially that it was about slavery as well. Slaves needed to grow food for those farmers who were no longer farming and also produce food for workers. All right, we also know that labor was hard to get, so they used orphans, children with no parents, to work in these factories 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, okay? That's a long time. Little children, and what happens? Accidents happen constantly. Why? Because these machines are fast, they're new. These kids are 4, 5, 6 years old, 10 years old. Even adults are having difficulty with this. It did cause a slightly higher standard of living for everyone, but actually the people who own the businesses were the ones that lived very well. The workers in factories lived in small areas which were crowded and dirty, called tenements. People were having healthier diets because food could be produced quickly, and they had refrigeration at this point. Some people had refrigeration, so food wasn't spoiling. There was better housing for the rich, terrible housing for the poor. Again, the tenements were horrible. Families lived on top of families. There was no running water. Some rooms had no windows. Some people lived in conditions where there were no windows because they built things on top of each other. The courtyard between buildings was oftentimes used as the bathroom. People would go outside and dump their waste out there. So you can imagine the disease and the smell and the dirt during that time. People were getting more education as far as being able to learn different trades. But there was a big job being done in the factories. Many unsafe conditions took place and many people died. The child labor problem was really an issue. The owners of factories were only interested in having workers, that's all. They believed they actually owned the workers. They didn't care whether they were sick, they didn't care if they got hurt, and people at that time were very frightened to speak up about this, because if they spoke up about it, they might lose their job, and there were plenty of other people waiting to take it. Let's see. There was at one point, and this is a very famous example of how bad it was to work in a factory during this time. It's New York City. It's the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. They're making clothing there. Most of the people who are working there are women and young children. It's towards the end of the shift in the afternoon, around 4 o'clock. One of the things that these factory owners would do is they would lock the doors to keep the employees in there from going outside to get a breath of air or to slow down on production. The doors are locked. Let me show you what happens.
Simple small talk conversations, all the way to job interview prep for that particular position. Hi, I'm Yuban, studying International Studies and Economics at Johns Hopkins University, and I've been teaching at Ringo for the past 2 years. Ringo is an online one-on-one English learning platform that connects students from top universities across the United States and the United Kingdom with individuals hoping to improve the form.
Remember how horrible this is. Look at the conditions and see what happens here.
On April 5th, 1911, 400,000 people lined the rain-drenched sidewalks of New York as an empty horse-drawn hearse crept from the dank, narrow streets of the Lower East Side toward the skyscrapers towering over Madison Square. New Yorkers from all walks of life had come to pay tribute to the unidentified victims of the Triangle Fire, the deadliest workplace accident in the city's history. A few weeks earlier, the workers had been forgotten cogs in America's immense industrial machine. Now, 1 in 10 New Yorkers were there to claim them as their own.
Public conscience thought they had failed these young women. They had somehow not protected them.
There was a recognition, wait, these girls can't die in vain. That was said over and over and over again, as if the city had somehow turned its back on them.
And they did.
If there weren't massive funerals, it would have been very easy for the city and the city officials to say, well, this is it's sort of a natural disaster, it's a terrible thing, but there's nothing anyone can do about it.
If you ask the average American, is it okay for workers to work in a shop where the conditions are so dangerous that it could cost them their lives and not have government intervene? Most people would say no. There's a line. The Triangle Fire drew that line. It burned that line, really, into the nation's conscience.
This is an area of tenements. They have their clothes hanging out in alleys, very close together.
Every morning, 6 days a week, more than 100,000 people poured out onto the streets of the Lower East Side, headed toward another day's work in the city's garment factories. Many were young women in their teens. Some were girls as young as 10. They were immigrants, Italians who had fled natural disaster, Jews who had escaped persecution in Russia, Ukraine, Poland. Their families had chosen America for its promise of a better future. But even the youngest daughters had come to understand that their precarious hold on the American dream depended on their willingness to work.
Father had to take me to the shop and not be late for his own work. I was eager to begin life on my own responsibility, but was also afraid. "Don't look so frightened," he said.
These young girls weren't just earning money for their own clothes or to, go out to a dance hall or to Coney Island. They were earning money to support the family.
Economic security was the American dream for many of them. Making enough money to be able to put food on the table, not worry about making rent for the week.
As the throng disappeared into sweatshops and tenement apartments, several hundred workers veered off toward the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in the heart of Greenwich Village. At the base of the Ash Building, men and women stepped into wooden freight elevators to ascend to the Triangle Factory on the 8th and 9th floors. Workers like Michaela Marciano, who managed to send a few dollars to her family in Italy every month. Or Julia Rosen, whose 17-year-old son worked alongside her to help support 3 younger children. Or Catherine Maltese, whose 13-year-old daughter wasn't too young to join her on the factory floor.
Getting a job in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a pretty desired position because they were working in a much more modern factory environment. High ceilings, big windows, compared to the coal stove heated, dusty, hugely crowded sweatshop rooms. Triangle was a plum.
But even at the Triangle, sewing machine operators faced a 14-hour workday for $2 a day at most. And that was before bosses docked their pay for the needles, the thread, the electricity they used.
Sometimes you work at a big machine, and it's not working right. One of the needles skips, and you get blamed for mistakes. The same machines, the same surrounding. Shirtwaists, shirtwaists, and more shirtwaists.
On the 10th floor, the Triangle owners could feel their vast machine shuddering below. Max Blank and Isaac Harris had made Triangle a $1 million a year behemoth, mass-producing the garment every modern woman must have, the shirtwaist. Harris and Blank were known as the Shirtwaist Kings, but their empire, as they saw it, was under constant siege. After 20 years, the shirtwaist was getting stale. Fashion editors began to showcase colorful dresses for the modern woman and turned up their noses at the bourgeois waist. No matter how much silk embroidery Harris added to their designs, the Triangle sales charts sloped down. Material and shipping costs seemed always to be rising. Profit margins matched this year's fashion, teasingly sheer.
For Max and Isaac, there was this constant awareness that they were, as successful and as rich as they were one bad season away from being broke. The competition was enormously fierce. 500 blouse makers on the island of Manhattan alone.
while they're getting the orders from the department stores, there's some small shop half a mile away that's willing to beat them by half. So it's all about continuous production to get as much cloth turned into a product as possible at the lowest possible price.
That summer, there was a growing new threat.
And this is
All over the
important
city,
part.
garment
Listen-
workers were agitating for shorter hours, better pay, safer shops, unions.
So this is
Harris and Blank saw it in the papers every day
organization unions.
and on the streets below. Workers were walking off the job by the tens, scores, hundreds. The partners even suspected talk of union on their own shop floor.
Unionization was the single largest fear for most of these employers. They were terrified that unions would come in because that would diminish their authority over the workplace.
The right to control their own factory was an article of faith for Harris and Blank, as for hundreds of business owners just like them.
Okay, so we're seeing that these. Hold on.
Knows how best to navigate your taxes for this year. They're experts. We trust experts to help us out for everything. Why not do it with your taxes?
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about progressives. No, Stan.
Progressive, yeah. You know, like these guys who used to work.
Stop sharing. Here. Okay, so what do we see? We saw horrible conditions that these people were working in. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, $2 a week. And then after $2, they charged the people who were making the garments for them, right? They charged them for the thread if they broke a needle. Heaven forbid they broke a sewing machine, what would happen then? People were getting tired of being treated that way. And this is when there is a talk of labor unions starting. Labor unions were going to get people to unite into one group so that they could get better conditions. They wanted better working conditions. They wanted higher wages. They wanted to work fewer hours. They wanted to be taken care of. If they got hurt on work, that there would be medical assistance for them. These are poor people. They don't just run off with their health insurance to the hospital when their hand gets mangled, right? They want the companies to take responsibility. And later, they also want paid vacation days. The first labor unions were started by a man named Samuel Gompers, and he started the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, right? This union starts to put in place conditions where child labor is prohibited. Young children cannot work anymore. People begin to get their salary or wages that are compensating the amount of time that they're working and not having to pay, say, a factory owner for the thread that they're using to make the man's garments. The women during this time were having a very difficult time. As you know, mainly women were in charge of taking care of the home. They would have to make sure the clothing was washed. They'd have to make sure that they get to the market and buy food. In addition, they'd have to cook food. They'd have to take care of their children and their husbands. And now they were working in factories. So on top of doing all those jobs, they were working 12 hours a day. Many women worked from sunup to sundown every day with very little rest, and many got very sick. Men said, and let me read this, a true woman was one who could completely manage a household, tend to the needs of their husband and their children, and go to work. What do you think about that? Nothing was said about men in that way, only women. Recruiters like to have women recruited from the farmlands because if they came, they generally stayed for a short period of time, 2 or 3 years. Why? Well, of course, the present thought at that time was by then a woman would meet a man and get married and go and tend to the home and perhaps not return to the factory. Well, they liked that because then they didn't have long-term workers. Without long-term workers in the mills and in the factories, they felt that they didn't have to really provide much in the way of benefits to them. They also felt that these women were desperate for a job, so they could pay them less. All right? They could treat them poorly, and they could get away with that. Remember, wealthy families during this time, the owners of these factories and these manufacturing plants lived well. The workers lived extremely poorly. And you saw a part in there where you saw how the tenements looked, close together, no running water, no lights, all right? And later, laws are being passed so that housing improves. Each room has to have at least one outside facing window to let in air for ventilation, to let in natural light. They begin to talk about ways to get rid of human waste, how to cut down on how many people are living in one small space. Okay? During this time, there were lots of streetcars, and you saw them in the video. The streetcars were the things that helped people get from further from their house to other places, or if they were living on the outskirts of town, to get there. Okay, so streetcars came with the progress. But one of the problems, and it's the same problem we see today, is this progress was not good for the environment. Well, how so, you ask? Well, did you see that smoke coming out from the coal factories? They were polluting the water. They were polluting the air. Waste was being dumped into the waterways. So just as we fight about the environment today, people were also beginning to see that they were polluting the area. The cities were extremely crowded. There were still horses in use. Their waste would be found on the street. But many immigrants came to the United States for a better life. And as you saw in the video, women would bring their young children with them to work in the factory. Well, there's 2 reasons for that. Who would watch them while they were at work? They didn't have daycare centers. They didn't have nannies. There were no babysitters. So if they brought their child with them to work, not only did they know where the child was, but that child could help bring in money for the family and put food on the table. With the growing population, disease is coming up, and factory workers living in those terrible tenants spread the disease amongst each other. Tenement houses were so crowded and such fire safety hazards that in 1905, the Tenement House Act was erected. And that, as I told you, said they had to have outdoor facing windows for circulation. They had to have certain fire standards so that if one room went on fire, the whole building was engulfed. They also began talking about putting in some kind of indoor plumbing. right? New York was one of the first places to enact the Tenement Act. Why? Because we had so many immigrants and so many tenements, and that was really important. So then at this point, okay, at this point, looking at the Industrial Revolution, we went from people who lived on farms, leaving that way of life, coming to live in the city, hoping for a better way of life. The Industrial Revolution brought ways to manufacture goods quickly and easily. However, it also brought dangers to the people who were operating these machines. And think about it. If you were working 14 hours straight, 6 days a week, maybe you'd start to fall asleep after a while, and your hand could fall into a machine and get cut off. The description of the little girl, she went through the whole machine, her whole body torn apart. The Industrial Revolution worked on the steam engine, which worked as far as getting machinery to move, but also to transport people on the train, okay, in trolleys, on boats, so they could move materials more easily. They sound like wonderful things, and yes, they were. It was the beginning of the change of the world. As we saw in the first video, people in 1320, and 1420 AD basically lived the same way. But now with this change in the 18th century and 19th century, people are starting to do things differently. They are moving into the city. Shops are being open. People are buying food where they didn't have to farm anymore at stores. So it was the beginning of the rise of cities, okay? The rise of cities were one of the main things that came out of the Industrial Revolution. Let me see if I can get that for you. Oh, I don't see it. It's okay. I'll talk to you about that. The rise of cities. People come in, they need a place to stay. After a while, when conditions started to get better with the AFL and then later the CIO, another part of the unions come together, people are starting to work at jobs for less hours a day. Children aren't working as many hours. Women are still getting paid less than men, as we see today. But the conditions are improving. It is no longer legal for employers to look at the employees as like material, like they own them. They had to give them a certain amount of respect and help, right? They were getting help if they got hurt on the job. There was a good competition between manufacturing. Things were being made, different metals, which made things easier as far as putting together machines and engines and cars. Things were looking better, right? The Industrial Revolution brought many, many changes to the world. And as I said, it was the start of the life that we know now. We know in the very beginning, in the first stage, that was when they started making things a little at a time. In the second stage, which was considered the great stage, they were able to look at what they've made and also expand upon it. And then in the third stage, which is where we are, well, actually started in the 60s, but this is where we are. We're still in an industrial revolution. Think about how quickly computers and cell phones changed now. When computers first came out, it took a long time for them to change. They were huge, right? Cell phones were huge. No one had them. Only a few people had them. Now everybody has one, right? So those conditions and those things all came about because of the Industrial Revolution. So the social changes that happened were increased production of goods, higher standards of living after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, okay? People ate more healthy, diets were better, better housing later came about, and people were having time to, when they were off, maybe read a little bit, study a little bit. Education was coming into view, and goods became more cheaply made. What were some of the problems of the Industrial Revolution when it started? The long hours, the little pay, the safety issues, putting orphans and children to work. That there was such a really big mark between the owners of the factories and the employees. The owners rich, having nice things, the employees living in tenements, okay? What happened? People got ticked off. They were angry, okay? They were angry about what's going on. So they started to band together to form unions. And yes, the unions were great. They helped to improve the working conditions, gave people higher wages, took away the child labor laws. Children could not be put to work. Even today, when you go and your child is 16 and they want to get a job, the child labor laws are still in place. 16-year-old can only work 4 hours a day when school is in session. And they can't work after 9 o'clock. And at 17, that changes, and they can work a little longer. When school's not in session, and if a 16-year-old wants to work, the labor law says, yes, they could work more hours. But they can't work 100 hours, okay? So those laws are in place today. And remember, getting medical help if you got hurt on work, and also having a day or two off for vacation. So the labor unions were a great help to the people at that time. The rise of cities comes about because people are moving into the city to get this job. And because of transportation with the trolleys and the streetcars, people could live on the outskirts, the suburbs, and come into work. Not only having to walk and living in the tenements, they can live a little further out with the inventions of the trolley and the streetcars. And now average homes were starting to have better things. Eventually some indoor plumbing. They didn't have phones and they didn't have TVs, and most people, at least half the children, lived in poverty, but the level of living was coming up. So this was a very, very important time. And remember again, because of the Industrial Revolution and because of the crowding, especially in cities like New York City, okay, the tenements began to change. And when that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire took place, you saw how many people in New York City came out for the funerals of mothers and daughters and grandmothers, because those are who the people were that worked there. And they couldn't get out. The fire started at the bottom of the building and moved up rapidly, and some of the doors were locked. They'll never have that. You always see things now. What do they have? Fire exit. That started after this factory fire. So it was a very important movement in the United States. Well, I hope you enjoyed your class today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Try to stay warm. If you have not taken your midterm, 1 or 2 of you have not, you need to do so because I'm going to start to close that out. Okay? If you have any questions or any problems, please contact Jake, and I'll see everybody next week. Bye.